Hi everybody. I decided to try something a little bit different with this installment of my Trite sayings. Obviously it's a bit of a different medium and I hope it works out a little bit better than the long form writing. I'll do my best to keep this relatively short. I'm sure that by now you've seen the link for the video and you can tell whether or not I succeeded in that. So living in the South, I'm sure that you've had somebody say to you at some time when you were encountering or dealing with something very difficult, not to worry, to let it go, that it's all according to God's plan. It's one of those things from people that I'm sure mean well, but they haven't really thought through the repercussions of everything going according to God's plan. Now, often I'm sure people like to focus on the thought of God's plan being something that presents a control over the uncontrollable. It allows us to live in a universe where all of the horrible things that happen are part of some greater purpose, where it's all going to work out well in the end. But the darker side of that is that if everything that happens is according to a plan, then it means that everything that happens is according to that plan. Every good thing, every bad thing. And ultimately, it's outside of our control. And while some people may really enjoy the thought of having the world in somebody else's control, truthfully, to me, it's a very existentially horrifying concept. Part of what makes it so horrifying is that not only are you not in control of any of your actions at all, but that it means that because horrible things happen to us, that somebody is intentionally making those horrible things happen to us. And I think it's that second part that seems to be overlooked by a lot of people who use that phrase. Now, concerning the first part, the lack of control, I may come back and speak on that more in depth at a later time, but in short, I want you to think about the concept of an all-powerful creature. Now, this is normally described as an omnipotent, omniscient, fully benevolent God, all-powerful, all-knowing, and whose plan is ultimately meant to be a very beneficial, benevolent, caring plan. Ultimately, though, it means that every action that is taken, that has ever been taken, ever will be taken, is preordained. And that's part of the biggest issue with this. If all of the actions are preordained, then it means that if you get up in the morning, you wake up late, you're running behind, you stub your toe, you miss your shower, you jump in the car, you're rushing to work, you run a red light, and you smash into a group of toddlers crossing the street. It's not your fault. It was preordained. It was all part of God's plan. Now, this is a situation where the thought that this is a horrible thing that happened, but there's a greater purpose to it, would definitely be appealing to people. But you have to also understand that if all of those actions, some of them that you thought were in your control and some that you thought were outside of it, were truly outside of your control, then it means that your life is functionally no different than that of a program that's created and run. Every option that you thought was your own was not your own. And that applies to you and it applies to everybody else. That would mean that nothing that anybody did would ultimately be their responsibility. Now, for these same people who will tell you not to worry because everything is part of God's plan, unfortunately, it also means that all of their hard work means nothing because it's going to be overridden by God's plan. In fact, their hard work failing would specifically be part of that God's plan. It also means that any prayers that are given for help or for intervention are ultimately useless. If you're not allowed to change God's plan, then whatever you pray for doesn't matter. If it's not part of the plan, it won't happen. If it is part of the plan, it would have happened without you praying at all. Ultimately, the fact that you do or don't pray would be part of the plan. And the only reason that I seem to be harping on this is because it does come back to the fact that if everything that happens is part of somebody else's plan, you have no choices. That also means that ultimately, neither you nor anyone else is responsible for anything that happens. And ultimately, it would mean that all of our decisions are meaningless. Again, that may appeal to some people. People who would like to have that burden of responsibility taken off of their hands. Personally, that's a terrifying concept to me. Now, the second concern out of this, also hinging on the thought that we're talking of a universe that's controlled by the traditional Abrahamic God, the God that's all powerful, all knowing, completely benevolent. Again, if everything is going according to this God's plan, there are two situations that you have to consider, and it seems like only one of them can be true. Since we know for a fact that suffering occurs, that we've seen it in our lives and we've seen it in the lives of others, you have to consider either that this God, who people consider to be all powerful, all knowing, is not one or both of those things. If the God was all powerful, then it would be able to accomplish its plan without the need for suffering. If the God requires suffering to be part of its plan, then that ultimately means that the God is not all powerful. Alternately, let's say that the God is all powerful, that the God is all knowing. They know how to accomplish anything and they have the power to do so. We again know that suffering exists. It is a fact of life that cannot be overlooked. So if this God that can do anything and knows how to do anything has a plan and integrates suffering as part of it, it's because they chose to do so, not that they had to. That means that this God in question chose humans to live relatively short, painful lives when there was another option that could have accomplished the same thing. And in this situation, we know that there was another option because we're discussing somebody who is all powerful. Technically, in this second situation, since this is the plan that this God created and that it wants to follow in this certain way, you have to accept that the God actually wants you to suffer. Now, some people may say that pain and suffering is not God's fault, that it's the fault of Adam and Eve, and that they brought it upon us in their act of original sin, their act of original rebellion against God's plan. But again, you have to accept that if everything happens according to God's plan, then that original sin was part of the plan. That means that all of the pain and suffering that humanity has had to deal with were part of this all-powerful, all-knowing, supposedly benevolent God's plan, and was not the fault of anybody else. Now, you may say that nothing I've said proves that things don't happen according to the plan of this God that you've identified. And you're right, they don't. Nothing that I've said actually proves that things don't happen according to God's plan. Of course, nothing I've said proves that we aren't living in a massive computer simulation and that I'm not an actual person, that I'm a programmed intelligence who's been constructed for the specific purpose of delivering this message. Either one of those could be true, and I couldn't prove them either way or the other. But they both carry the same concern, the same repercussion, that none of our choices are our own to make, that everything happens according to God's or the all-powerful programmer's plan. And that means that we have no agency in our own futures. That means that every plan you make to better yourself, to have this greater future that you believe God has planned for you, are irrelevant. Because God may only have a horrible death planned for you. He may have a plan for you to live another 100 years, and every one of them may be horrible. Could have a plan for you to live 1,000 years, and every one will be great. But it won't be because of anything that you've done or anything that anyone else has done. So ultimately, it does seem like I've spent a lot more time focusing on the free choice aspect of this than anything else. But overall, I really do hope that if you come away from this with nothing else, really think through what it means before you say to somebody who's experiencing a difficult or horrible situation not to worry, because everything happens according to God's plan. Based on that thought process, they may need to worry because God's plan may be for their suffering to continue from now until the end of time. Or maybe you could consider the alternative option. Maybe there is no all-powerful God directing our actions and moving through every atom of the universe, every second of every day. Maybe we're all that's here. It's just us, alone, together. And that's not so bad. If we have the ability to choose our actions, then we can choose how we act towards each other. We can see other people who are in pain, who are suffering, who are going through difficult things, and we can make a choice to use whatever power we have, no matter how limited, to help them and make their existence better. And they can do the same for us. That's ultimately our power. We can't always get what we want out of life. We can't always win the fight against a huge, uncaring universe. But we can fight together. On the other hand, if you're watching this and you're inflamed with righteous anger and indignation at my blasphemy, don't worry, it's not my fault. Based on everything that you believe, everything I say is according to his plan. So please direct your complaints to the asshole upstairs, not this one. In the meantime, I'll be here, and I'll do whatever I can to help make this life a little bit better. Of course, take my words as you will. These are just a few thoughts from an insane bookworm. Be safe and treat each other well.